I'm Emily Carter, 32 years old, and in my father's empire, I've always been seen as the quiet one, useful but invisible. At every family dinner, at every corporate gathering, Richard Carter made it clear. My brother Ethan was the heir, the future. I was tolerated as the translator, nothing more. My degrees, my preparation, my work, none of it mattered, next to the son who carried his shadow. But the breaking point came in the boardroom. Surrounded by directors and foreign delegates, I offered a quiet correction that would have saved us millions. My father turned it into a joke. He laughed, calling me just the translator, and the room laughed with him. Their smirk stung deeper than his words. That was when I realized my silence could no longer protect me. It had to become my weapon. Ever been humiliated by the very person who should have defended you? Hit like if someone ever stole your credit. Comment if you've ever been dismissed when you knew the truth. It all began in that boardroom, the moment his laughter tried to erase me. The sound of his voice, deep, amused, and cruelly casual, landed heavier than the fluorescent lights above. It wasn't the first time, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. I had heard that exact timbre before. At family dinners when I corrected a mispronounced phrase, at reunions when he belittled my graduate degree, at every moment when acknowledgement should have been given but was withheld, like oxygen. Richard Carter had perfected the art of reducing me to a single utility. The boardroom's glass walls reflected every smirk, every exchange of glances from the directors seated around the table. My younger brother Ethan sat at the far end, posture rigid, his tie too tight, his eyes darting between us as if he had wandered into a battle zone. He would never admit it, but his silence was complicity. I saw him swallow hard, the way a man does when he knows he should speak but won't. I had spoken only once during that tense negotiation. One word, really an adjustment to a phrase that would have shifted a contract clause into our favor. My correction was quiet, deliberate, a whisper offered as support. Yet in an instant Richard had weaponized it against me. "You hear that?" he announced with a grin sharp enough to cut. "Our translator thinks she can rewrite policy now." His laughter rolled like thunder, and the room joined in not because the joke was funny, but because no one dared resist. My palms pressed into the polished wood of the table. The cold surface steadied me, though inside my chest a storm brewed. I stared at the papers in front of me, the ink of foreign clauses blurring as my vision stung. I had worked weeks to prepare the linguistic bridges that underpinned this negotiation, and still I was treated as ornamental. One of the foreign clients shifted in his chair. He was a man of quiet presence, eyes keen, lips twitching with something close to sympathy. When our gazes met, he dipped his head in the slightest nod. Recognition. Validation. It was subtle, but it was there. In that microsecond, I felt an entire argument for my worth pass unspoken between us. Ethan coughed into his fist, the sound awkward, almost apologetic. I caught the flicker of discomfort on his face. He knew Richard had crossed a line. But Ethan remained silent, loyal to the power that fed him. My father's shadow was long, and Ethan still lived in it. The negotiation rolled forward, Richard in command, gesturing broadly, speaking with the force of a man who never doubted himself. I sat back, forcing my breathing into rhythm, observing every clause, every hesitation in the foreign delegates' expressions. I realized, not for the first time, that my silence was misread as weakness. They didn't know silence was a choice, that I catalogued everything: tones, pauses, betrayals. When the conversation reached another subtle turn, Richard leaned across the table, fixing me with that patronizing smile reserved for public humiliation. "You're not here to lead, Emily. You're here to translate." The words landed like a slap. Every molecule in the room shifted. I felt the directors stiffen, some averting their eyes, others hiding smirks. Ethan dropped his gaze entirely. My throat tightened, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I lowered my eyes to the folder before me. My pulse hammered, my nails dug into the fabric of my skirt, but I remained still. That stillness was not surrender, it was armor. In that stillness, I made a vow I did not yet dare to articulate aloud. The meeting closed with handshakes, staged smiles, and Richard's booming voice proclaiming victory. I walked out behind him, footsteps muffled on the carpet, my mind already turning, shaping the fragments of insult into something sharp enough to cut back one day. As the glass doors slid shut behind us, and the echo of laughter died, I bit my tongue but whispered to myself, "Then I'll let my silence speak louder than you think." A late-night phone call delivers a cryptic phrase, "Oracle still watches." The words cracked through the darkness like a stone against glass. I jolted upright, papers scattering from my lap onto the floor. The apartment was still, except for the muted hum of the city outside, headlights streaking across the walls through blinds half shut. I pressed the phone harder to my ear, my breath quickening. No one had called me that in years. I hadn't heard the name Oracle since the nights when my hands shook over encrypted transmissions, when I served as the invisible bridge in crises that never reached the public eye. I had buried that part of me under corporate monotony, letting my father's dismissive laugh drown it out. Yet here it was, pulled from the shadows like a ghost I never wanted to face again. "Who is this?" My voice was steadier than I expected, but inside I felt the quake of memory. Silence lingered. Then the faintest chuckle, low and assured. The line crackled as if it came from far across the sea. "You always demanded proof. Very well. Do you recall the storm in the strait? The night when words mattered more than missiles?" I froze. My mind lurched backward, to the cramped communications hub, the flicker of red lights, the tight-lipped officers watching me while I decoded words that could decide war or peace. I remembered the moment I translated a phrase not as it was written, but as it was meant, averting catastrophe in a way no machine ever could. Only 2 men had thanked me that night. One was a commander whose name I forgot. The other was an admiral whose respect I had never expected to earn. The voice on the phone belonged to him, Admiral Whitmore. I swallowed hard, pacing the room. My bare feet pressed against piles of scattered documents, contracts, policy briefs, fragments of languages that had become my armor. "Why now?" I asked, though the better question was why ever. Before an answer came, my phone buzzed again. A second line. "Ethan." I hesitated but switched. His voice spilled out in a hushed rush. "Emily, Dad's already planning for the Carter Gala. It's going to be bigger this year. Foreign ministers, military brass. He's polishing his image like nothing ever touched him. Just be careful." His warning sounded half-hearted, like a man caught between duty and fear. I wanted to demand why he stayed silent in the boardroom, why he let Richard crush me, but the sound of his exhale told me the answer. Survival. He lived under Dad's control, even if it cost him his spine. "I'll manage," I said flatly, cutting him off before the guilt in his tone bled into me. I returned to the original line, pulse pounding. Whitmore's voice was waiting, calm, unyielding. "You're not forgotten, Oracle. They may call you a translator, but I know better. The Carter name is not the only one at stake. They'll come for your father soon, and you will be caught in the storm." The line clicked dead. I stood in the silence of my apartment, the city's distant horns muffled behind the glass. My vow from earlier echoed back at me, louder now. My silence would speak. But with that one call, silence no longer felt safe. "They'll come for your father soon, and you will be caught in the storm." The Carter family dinner feels more like a corporate negotiation. The long oak tables stretched like a battlefield between us, polished so smooth I could see the trembling reflection of my wineglass. Richard sat at the head, flanked by allies whose smiles were as sharp as the silver cutlery. Crystal chandeliers glared down from above, scattering light across plates no one really cared to touch. Outside, autumn leaves whispered against the glass walls, but inside, the air was tight, staged, heavy with rehearsed laughter. He talked the way he always did, numbers, acquisitions, partnerships, his voice rising and falling like a general briefing troops before a campaign. "Carter Global is entering its most profitable quarter yet," he announced, holding his glass aloft. His allies nodded, eyes glinting with the reflection of wealth. No mention of risk, no hint of the cracks already forming in his empire. I pushed the food on my plate, half listening, half counting the seconds before his gaze would cut toward me. Every gesture of his was a reminder of the boardroom humiliation, still echoing in my head. But Ethan was different tonight. He leaned forward occasionally, stealing glances at me as if words pressed at the back of his throat but refused to be spoken aloud. That's when I noticed it. A folder at the elbow of one of Richard's associates. Plain leather, barely visible beneath the man's hand, but stamped with a logo I didn't recognize. A simple mark, a coiled circle surrounding 3 lines. My pulse jumped. Origin Logistics. I didn't know why it felt familiar, but the unease was instant, as if some old archive in my mind had been unlocked without my consent. Ethan shifted beside me, coughing lightly as he slipped his hand under the table. A folded slip of paper brushed against my fingers. I palmed it quickly, sliding it under the napkin. When I glanced down, I saw his handwriting, rushed and uneven. Dad's hiding something. I looked up at him. His eyes, uncertain and pleading, told me more than the words ever could. He was still afraid, still tethered to Richard's control, but something inside him was fraying. He wanted me to see, to know, even if he couldn't say it aloud. Richard's laughter cut through my thoughts. He was standing now, commanding the room with stories of foreign partnerships, dismissing any notion of instability with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Then his gaze landed on me. My stomach tightened. "Emily," he said smoothly, "our guest here insists you had an opinion about the recent negotiations. Do you still?" The table shifted, eyes narrowing toward me, waiting for a misstep. I kept my tone neutral. Only that the contracts suggest more liability than gain. If those risks aren't managed, do not embarrass me again. His voice sliced through mine. The table fell into stunned silence, the clinking of cutlery stopping mid-motion. His allies smirked faintly, some out of loyalty, others out of fear. But all of them watched me shrink back in my seat. My cheeks burned, but I forced myself not to lower my gaze. I reached for the glass of water, steadying my hand with effort. Then, as if retreating into the only defense left, I shifted my eyes back toward that folder. My fingertips drummed softly against the tablecloth, unnoticed by anyone but me. The word stamped in the corner seemed to pulse with weight. Origin Logistics. My breath hitched, the syllables clawing into me with the certainty of something far larger than Richard's empire. Whatever he was hiding, it began here. Emily scans the folder quietly, her eyes freeze at the name, Origin Logistics. A cream envelope slides under my office door at dawn. The sound was faint, a soft whisper against the polished floor, but it startled me enough to spill coffee across a stack of notes. My office at Carter Global was never meant to be lived in, yet there I was, bleary-eyed with the October haze still clinging to the skyline beyond the glass towers. The corridors outside were empty, the kind of silence only found before the building woke with its army of executives and assistants. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before touching it. Cream, unmarked, no logo. Its edges were crisp, as though it had been prepared deliberately for this ritual of secrecy. My pulse beat faster as I bent down and picked it up. The weight inside wasn't thick, just a few sheets of paper, folded neatly. Sliding my finger along the seam, I unfolded the contents onto my desk. Receipts, shipping manifests. Each one bore the same inked seal, the coiled circle and 3 lines of Origin Logistics. The mark I had seen the night before at Richard's dinner. The pages smelled faintly of printer toner, still sharp, as if rushed through a copy machine hours ago. At first, they looked ordinary. Dates, shipments, dock numbers. But the longer I stared, the more something felt wrong. The metadata in the header's digital print tags I had trained myself to notice during my brief military stint showed inconsistencies. Some dates had been rewritten, the font spacing uneven, numbers sitting too far from their decimal points. Someone had doctored these receipts. Someone had wanted these shipments to disappear behind smoke and forged timelines. I reached for a pen, circling the mismatched digits, my heart knocking against my ribs. If Richard was connected to these falsified records, then Origin wasn't just a partner, it was a front. A cover for something darker. A sudden knock on the door jolted me. My hand swept the papers into the drawer before the knob turned. The security guard from the lobby peeked in, his cap tilted too low over tired eyes. "Miss Carter? You're in early again. Working too hard?" His voice carried the casual suspicion of a man who'd seen too many executives crumble under pressure. I forced a smile, gripping the edge of my desk. "Couldn't sleep, just catching up." He nodded slowly, scanning the room as though gauging whether my answer was worth believing. Then he tugged at his cap and muttered, "Well, don't let the building swallow you." His footsteps echoed back into the empty corridor, leaving me in a vacuum of racing thoughts. I barely had time to exhale when the air shifted again. The door opened without a knock this time. Richard stepped inside, his cologne preceding him like an invasion. His eyes landed immediately on my desk, on the drawer I had just closed. "You're here early," he said, too casually. Suspicion edged every syllable. I kept my expression neutral, smoothing the papers on the surface that had nothing to do with the envelope. "Preparing for the quarterly reviews," I replied, willing my hands not to tremble. He lingered longer than necessary, his gaze sharp enough to pierce the drawer. I could almost feel the sweat at my temple as silence stretched. Then, with a half smirk that revealed nothing and everything at once, He adjusted his cufflinks and walked out without another word. My knees loosened only when the door clicked shut. I opened the drawer just enough to confirm the envelope was still there, folded tight, secrets intact. My phone buzzed at that exact moment, making me flinch. On the screen glowed a single text message from an unknown number. That's only a fraction. More to come. S.A. Admiral Whitmore waits at the Lincoln Memorial, hat low against the wind. The monument loomed behind him in solemn silence, its marble columns glowing faintly in the dying light. The October air was colder than I had expected, and the wind coming off the reflecting pool clawed through my coat. I tightened the collar, keeping my pace steady, though my heart hammered like I was walking toward a battlefield instead of a national monument. For 2 days I had wrestled with the envelope, the forged receipts, the text signed only with initials. My instincts screamed at me to burn it all and walk away, but the words from the late-night call in my apartment clung to me. Oracle still watches. And here he was, the man behind that voice, standing beneath Lincoln's carved gaze, like he'd been waiting all his life for me to arrive. "Emily," he said, his voice carrying despite the wind. He didn't move at first, only dipped his chin in acknowledgement. His posture was military perfect, even with age bending his shoulders. "I wondered if you'd come." "I almost didn't." My steps echoed on the stone until I stopped just a few feet away. My eyes flicked to the brim of his cap, shadowing his weathered face. "You called me out of nowhere, dropped cryptic lines, and now an envelope slides under my door? What game is this?" "It's not a game," he said simply. "And it's not about you anymore. It's about the web your father's spun." I pulled the envelope from inside my coat and held it up. These shipments, origin logistics, forged dates, shady ports. Why do I have them and not the FBI? Whitmore's jaw tightened. He turned toward the steps, motioning me to follow. I did, the two of us settling on the cold stone while the city traffic buzzed faintly in the distance. "Because," he said, lowering his voice, "the FBI doesn't want them. Carter Global is too big, too clean on the surface. But Origin," he paused, scanning the horizon as if even the wind carried ears. "Origin funnels money into covert international operations, weapons contracts, laundered deals disguised as cargo shipments, and every one of them is linked to your father's signature." I swallowed hard, the words sinking like stones. For a moment, I thought of Richard laughing at me in the boardroom, of him brushing me off at dinner. His arrogance had always been sharp enough to wound, but this was rot at the core. "You're saying my father isn't just corrupt," I whispered. "He's compromised." Whitmore finally turned to face me, his eyes steady beneath the brim of his cap. "Yes, he's not just building an empire, Emily. He's selling its foundation to whoever pays the most, and that makes him vulnerable." The chill in the air no longer came from the wind. I gripped the envelope tighter, realizing this wasn't only about my resentment anymore, it was about survival, mine and everyone connected to me. "Why me?" I asked, forcing the words out. "Why bring this to me, and not my brother? Not Congress? Why drag me back into something I left behind years ago?" He let out a breath that clouded in the twilight. "Because, when the Navy needed someone to untangle foreign codes during the Taiwan standoff, you did it without hesitation. Because Oracle was more than a translator, you were a shield. And now, the only way forward is through the same role. But this time, you'll be unmasking your own blood." The name, my call sign, rolled through me like fire finding dry kindling. Oracle. A part of me I had locked away suddenly stepped forward, sharper, steadier. I thought of every moment Richard had tried to erase me, reduce me, laugh me out of my own worth. I leaned closer, my voice barely audible over the wind. "Then I'll be more than a translator. I'll be the voice they can't silence." The weight of the vow hung in the cold air. For the first time since the boardroom humiliation, I felt a flicker of power rising inside me. Whitmore gave a slow nod, the kind a commander gives when a soldier accepts her orders. But before he could speak again, movement across the reflecting pool caught my eye. A figure stood in the shadows, phone raised, the faint glow of a screen illuminating his face just enough to show intent. He wasn't a tourist. He was watching us, recording or worse, reporting. I froze, breath caught in my throat, as Whitmore followed my gaze. The figure didn't move closer, only turned slightly, the phone still poised like a weapon. Across the reflecting pool, a shadowy figure watches us, phone in hand. Emily opens Sophie's encrypted file, heart racing at the first line. Carter Global Transaction, masked recipient. The glow of the monitor painted the office in ghostly blue, throwing long shadows across the rows of binders and glass walls. Outside, the November night pressed close, the skyline blinking like a silent warning. I leaned in, every muscle tense, as the lines of code unfolded across the screen. This was no ordinary ledger. Buried beneath layers of innocuous numbers, Sophie had built an architecture of concealment, a vault within a vault. A simple keystroke pulled me deeper until words emerged that had no place in any corporate account. Wire transfers to anonymous shells, masked recipients spread across continents, shipments listed under names that meant nothing until I traced them back, and every single one tethered to Carter Global. My hands shook as I took out a separate drive, duplicating the files offline. The sound of the fan whirring inside my laptop was suddenly too loud, as though even the machine knew it carried something poisonous. The headset on my desk buzzed once. I hesitated, then answered. A voice crackled through the encrypted channel, low, accented, urgent. Emily? Sophie. My own voice was barely a whisper. You see it now. Origin doesn't move money directly. They scatter it through shells, tiny companies that vanish once their purpose is done. Every strand leads back through your father's accounts. I closed my eyes, pressing a hand to my forehead. So it's true. Whitmore wasn't exaggerating. He's selling Carter Global piece by piece. He's more than selling, Sophie said. He's laundering money for people he shouldn't even be in the same room with. Arms, oil, intelligence leaks, you name it. Origin is the bloodstream. Carter Global is the heart pumping it all through. Her words hung heavy, thicker than the dark around me. I forced myself to keep typing, recording metadata, creating mirrored folders, leaving no trace in the system logs. My training returned like muscle memory. Oracle never leaves a footprint. The office door clicked. I jerked upright, slamming the laptop nearly shut. My father's assistant, sharp suit gleaming, leaned into the frame. Still here, Emily? Working too hard again. His tone was light, but his eyes lingered too long, sliding over my desk as though cataloging everything. I like the quiet, I answered evenly. My heart drummed against my ribs. He smirked, adjusted his tie, and left as casually as he'd come. The echo of his footsteps in the corridor faded slowly, but I didn't move until silence swallowed the space whole again. Only then did I open the screen a fraction, my reflection staring back at me over Sophie's coded trail. You almost got caught, Sophie said softly. You have to be careful. I exhaled hard, swallowing the panic. I can handle him. No, she cut in, her voice sharper now. You don't understand. You're not the only one digging. They know someone is inside the system, and they suspect you already. The word slammed into me like a cold blade. I froze, staring at the glowing lines of stolen truth on the screen. My pulse roared in my ears, louder than the city outside. Then I saw it, just the faintest glimmer, a tiny red dot blinking at the corner of my laptop. My throat went dry. The camera. A red light flickers on my laptop camera. Someone is watching. At a minor Carter Global press event, I slipped in one phrase that rattled the room. The auditorium gleamed with glass and steel, polished to reflect every camera flash. November sunlight filtered through the high windows, bright but brittle, as though even the day itself didn't trust what was about to unfold. I sat at the translation desk, headset snug, microphone tuned, my father at the center of the stage radiating authority he didn't deserve. Rows of board members and journalists waited like predators disguised as professionals, pens poised, cameras humming. Sophie's warning replayed in my mind. They suspect you already. If I was going to strike, I had to make it small, just enough to be felt, not enough to be fatal. Not yet. The French delegate began his remarks, voice smooth, rolling with the cadence of money and diplomacy. I translated faithfully until the line came. Nos comptes sont établis sur la transparence totale. Their accounts are built on complete transparency. I let a breath slide past my lips and chose different words. Our offshore accounts are designed with complete transparency. The room stilled. Pens paused mid-scratch. A single journalist's head lifted, eyes narrowing at the word offshore. He seized the opening like a shark catching blood. Mr. Carter, he called out across the polished silence, could you clarify what offshore accounts your company maintains? Richard froze. For one fractured second, his mask slipped, his gaze snapping toward me like a knife unsheathed. Then he smoothed his expression and gave a laugh too sharp, too quick. "I believe there has been a mistranslation," he said, the practiced charm nearly intact. But suspicion already crackled across the room, cameras angling in, journalists whispering. I kept my face serene, as though nothing had happened, my fingers steepled lightly in front of me. But inside, my pulse thundered. The seed had been planted. The press moved like hounds, questions overlapping, sharper, probing at shadows they hadn't dared before. Richard raised his voice, cutting through the noise, restoring control with sheer force of presence. But he knew it was me. When the session ended, applause fell flat. Richard leaned close, his cologne suffocating, his words venom meant only for me. "You're playing with fire, Emily." I met his eyes without blinking. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt behind his fury. That was enough. Hours later, alone in my apartment, my phone vibrated. A number I hadn't saved, but one I already recognized. I lifted it to my ear. Whitmore's voice was steady, carrying the weight of inevitability. "That spark will ignite faster than you think." The Carter boardroom felt like a courtroom as documents scattered across the polished oak table. The November air outside carried a gray chill. But inside, the heat came from the weight of unspoken accusation. The high walls of glass reflected every tense movement, every glance between the board members who had gathered at Richard's summons. My father sat at the head of the table, posture regal, gaze commanding, as though daring anyone to question his throne. I had come prepared. Sophie's encrypted file sat hidden on my tablet, metadata extracted and duplicated, the quiet heartbeat of evidence. The moment presented itself when a routine report of shipments crossed the table. I leaned forward, my voice steady though my stomach tightened. "This line here," I said, tapping the page, lists a shipment routed through Lisbon in early October. The dates don't align with the customs records. The metadata shows alteration, someone forged the timeline. Silence swept the room. Heads turned. Richard's jaw clenched, then relaxed into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Metadata?" he scoffed, voice laced with disdain. "Emily, are we really chasing shadows in code now? This is paranoia. Our investors need vision, not conspiracy theories." I held his gaze, refusing to shrink, though every instinct screamed that I had overstepped. "Paranoia doesn't erase digital fingerprints," I replied. "Auditors could confirm this." A murmur rippled down the table, the word auditors carrying its own gravity. That was when Ethan shifted in his chair, his voice breaking the tension. "Maybe she's right," he said carefully. "If we're clean, then independent confirmation strengthens us. If not," he trailed off, the implication sharp enough to hang in the air. Richard's mask cracked. His hand slammed against the oak table, the sound reverberating through the chamber like a gavel. "Enough! This family's legacy is not your courtroom." His words thundered across the polished wood, silencing even the whispers. No one spoke after that. The meeting dissolved under the pressure of his fury, board members filing out with guarded expressions, carrying questions they dared not voice aloud. Richard stood like a judge who had crushed a rebellion, but his glare lingered on me longer than anyone else. He knew I had struck close. Later that evening, as the city lights bled against my apartment windows, my phone buzzed. A message glowed across the screen, Ethan's name above it. "Dad's hiding numbers in a private ledger. Want proof?" The chandeliers blazed, gilded fire against the mirrored ceiling, and whispers swirled like smoke through the air as Washington's elite gathered for the Carter Thanksgiving Gala. The ballroom was a cathedral of power. Senators brushing shoulders with CEOs, journalists angling for quotes, the city's gaze drawn into the orbit of my father's empire. Beneath the shimmer of gold and crystal, I stood calm, one step away from turning his kingdom against him. Richard moved through the crowd like a monarch surveying his court, every handshake calculated, every smile rehearsed. Ethan lingered by the buffet, his eyes flicking toward me now and again, silent confirmation that he was ready if I faltered. Somewhere among the servers in crisp white uniforms, Sophie hid in plain sight. I hadn't seen her face tonight, but I knew her code was already inside the system, waiting. The gala reached its zenith when Richard summoned attention with a raised glass. "Tonight," he declared, voice booming against the velvet walls, "we celebrate family, legacy, and the unshakable foundation of Carter Global." Applause swelled, but it was brittle, and I sensed it would not last. My pulse quickened as the AV screen behind him shimmered to life, his carefully crafted presentation of quarterly triumphs and international partnerships. I breathed once, deeply. Sophie's files were hidden in the sequence, threaded through the slides like a trap waiting for its trigger. When the image shifted to a glowing map of trade routes, the first rupture struck. A flicker, brief but unmistakable, payment trails glowing like veins across the world. For a heartbeat, the screen froze, then a line of text burned bright origin logistics, masked recipient. Gasps broke across the tables, whispers turned sharp. A journalist leaned forward in his chair, scribbling furiously. Richard stiffened. Technical error, he barked toward the technicians, his mask already cracking. He tried to wave it off, commanding the staff to cut the feed. But Sophie's code was relentless. Another flash. Documents, transactions, dates, forged metadata, unraveling across the screen in a stuttering sequence of revelation. I felt the eyes of the room swing toward me, though I had not moved. The whispers sharpened into a storm. Is this real? Did she? What does it mean? Then came the moment no one expected. Admiral Whitmore rose from his seat, his uniform immaculate, his bearing unshakable. He turned, facing me across the crowd, and lifted his hand in a crisp salute. His voice carried over the chaos, clear and resonant. Oracle still serves. The room froze. For an instant, silence drowned everything, a silence so thick I felt the chandeliers might shatter under its weight. Then gasps, a tide of disbelief and awe, rippled across the hall. Cameras flashed in a frenzy, capturing my father's empire cracking under the pressure of truth. Richard's face drained of color, then flushed with fury. He jabbed a finger toward me, his voice shredding the calm facade he had worn for decades. "You will regret this," he roared, the words echoing beneath the chandeliers as photographers surged forward, their flashes blinding, their lenses transmitting his rage across the nation. The trap had been sprung, and the storm was only beginning. Flashbulbs popped like gunfire as I stepped through the marbled archway of the Senate inquiry chamber, the winter light refracting through the cameras and lenses that tracked my every move. Whispers followed, an undertone threading through the crowd. Oracle. She's the one they called Oracle. The title, once a secret buried in naval codes, now clung to me like a second skin. I lifted my chin, ignoring the glare of lights and the cutting whispers, and moved to the witness table. Richard was already seated, shoulders stiff beneath a tailored suit, his jaw set in iron defiance. The chamber was packed. Senators shuffled papers thick with exhibits, aides whispered hurried reminders, and the press leaned forward with hungry eyes. Admiral Whitmore caught mine from across the room, a subtle nod of assurance, while Ethan sat 2 seats behind my father, hands resting nervously on a slim leather binder, the ledger he had finally chosen to expose. The chairman struck his gavel. "This inquiry is convened to examine alleged financial misconduct and national security violations involving Carter Global." Richard leaned forward, voice smooth, clipped with disdain. "Carter Global is a pillar of American commerce. These accusations are political theater, nothing more." The first senator rose, holding up a stack of contracts. "Then perhaps you can explain these documents? Signatures mismatched, dates falsified." Richard's lips curled. "Forgery. Enemies seeking to smear us." My hands tightened on the folder before me. When the senator gestured for my response, I slid the first sheet across the table. My voice was steady, amplified by the hush that fell over the room. "These are not mere forgeries. These are translations of the original French agreements which my father signed." Here, I tapped the page. The metadata shows backdated edits, terms altered after approval, funds rerouted through origin logistics. Gasps rippled. Cameras clicked like hail. Richard's glare burned across the table, but I continued, heart hammering, refusing to shrink. Another senator adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents. "Miss Carter, how do you possess these materials?" "Because I was the translator of record for the negotiation. I archived the originals. The discrepancies became evident only when I compared both sets." The weight of truth pressed down on the chamber. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his mask faltering. "She misrepresents. She's not qualified." Ethan rose, his voice cutting, raw with restrained anger. "She's telling the truth." The room stilled as he opened his leather binder, producing handwritten notes, numbers carefully transcribed. "I found this ledger hidden in my father's private files. Off-the-record payments. The names match the companies she's identified." He slid it forward, defiance in his every gesture. "This is his handwriting. No one else's." For the first time in years, Richard's composure cracked visibly. His fist clenched. He half rose, voice rising with fury. "This is a witch hunt orchestrated by my daughter. The outburst echoed through the chamber, his words bouncing against the carved stone walls, amplified by microphones into every home watching the live feed. Reporters scribbled furiously, fingers flying across keyboards. Senators exchanged glances, the tide shifting. Whitmore folded his arms, silent but resolute, the mentor watching a battle he had long prepared me for. Then it happened. Phones buzzed simultaneously across the chamber, senators, aides, reporters, even the gallery. A breaking news alert pulsed on every screen, red and merciless. Exclusive leak: Carter Global wired funds to a sanctioned nation. The words glowed like fire, burning away denial, igniting scandal. The chamber erupted. Shouts, gasps, reporters scrambling to send updates. Richard froze, face blanched, his empire unraveling in real time. I sat still, pulse pounding, as the storm swallowed the room. I had not released this leak. Sophie had gone deeper into the servers than I had imagined, and now the entire nation knew. The flashbulbs returned, fiercer than ever, drowning the chamber in their light. And I knew this was only the beginning. Richard's face glared down from every television in America. His voice clipped mid-denial, frozen under a headline that burned across the screens. Traitor to his own board? The image looped in storefront windows, on tablets gripped by commuters, across airport terminals, and now, even here, spilling across the gates of the Carter Mansion, where reporters pressed against the wrought iron like waves battering a cliff. The man who once dismissed me as just the translator was now translated for the world in the starkest possible language: fraud, betrayal, corruption. Inside the mansion, chaos churned. The chandeliers rattled with the clamor of journalists barging into the entry hall, microphones thrust forward, cameras recording every desperate flicker of my father's face. Richard shouted for security, for silence, but every order was drowned under questions sharp as knives. Did you approve payments to sanctioned nations? Why are your children testifying against you? Was Origin Logistics a shell company under your control? I stood at the base of the marble staircase, calm in the storm, Ethan beside me with the ledger clutched in his hands. Admiral Whitmore kept watch near the doorway, a sentinel against the tide. Sophie's voice buzzed in my ear through the encrypted earpiece. Signal is live. I'm in the system. Ready when you are. Richard tried to swat away the journalists with the weight of his authority, but the cameras caught every beat of sweat, every crack in his voice. This is a grotesque violation of privacy, he roared. You vultures will not dictate the future of Carter Global. His words echoed, hollow, bouncing against walls that once magnified his dominance but now betrayed him. I raised the folder in my hands. You approved every one of Origin's contracts, I said, my voice amplified by the microphones that darted toward me. You signed them. You profited from them. And you endangered this nation doing so. The reporters surged, lenses flashing as I opened the folder. Contracts spilled into the air like confetti of ruined signatures, dates, routing slips. They struck the marble floor, scattered under the bright glare of the cameras. Richard lunged forward, face red with fury. Lies! Forged by enemies! This is nothing but a spectacle, Sophie's voice whispered in my ear, steady and sure. Now, the screens flickered, every camera suddenly hijacked by her code. On the monitors, on phones, on the very broadcast that Richard had tried to control, new images blazed, timestamps, approvals, electronic signatures bearing his hand. The system displayed each document alongside the time of approval, showing his direct involvement, undeniable, permanent. Gasps tore through the hall. A senator's voice piped in from the live feed echoed, "This is damning." Journalists shouted over one another, each more frenzied than the last. Ethan stood taller, eyes burning as though years of silence were finally breaking inside him. My father's composure collapsed. He turned on me, his voice raw, ragged, stripped of its grandeur. "You were never meant to be more than a translator," he screamed, spittle catching the light as it flew from his lips. Time slowed. Cameras froze that moment, the mighty Richard Carter reduced to a desperate man, unraveling before the nation. I didn't flinch. My voice came cool, steady, sharp as the blade he had forged for me with years of scorn. Then, let the world translate your lies. Silence fell. The reporters stopped shouting. The cameras clicked but without words, and for the first time Richard had no reply. The empire he had built on arrogance crumbled in that pause. The mask shattered completely. Carter Global's stock collapsed like a building gutted from within. plummeting 40% before the markets even paused to catch their breath. By dawn, the ticker screens pulsed red across the world, and the once proud empire Richard Carter had built now looked more like a cautionary tale scrolling across every news crawl. Legacy untouchable, he had declared in front of allies not long ago. Now that very legacy lay in pieces, bleeding value faster than anyone could contain. Inside headquarters, the boardroom was no longer a chamber of power, but a lifeboat full of panicked figures clawing for survival. Board members whispered furiously into phones, eyes darting to their portfolios, voices hushed but frantic. Some were already drafting resignation letters, others negotiating immunity through attorneys. Their movements reminded me of rats abandoning a sinking ship, clawing over one another in desperation. I stood near the glass wall, watching the December sun stretch cold shadows across Washington's skyline. Ethan sat 2 chairs down, flanked by regulators who had been called in without ceremony. His face was pale but resolute as he sifted through papers, answering pointed questions about transitional leadership. For the first time, I saw him wearing responsibility without hesitation. Richard entered late, his steps heavy, the weight of cameras and headlines pressed into his every breath. He ignored the stares, the whispers, even the chairman's cleared throat. His tie hung loose, eyes bloodshot from a night without sleep. Yet still, he carried himself with a stubborn defiance that almost mocked the ruin around him. "Gentlemen," one of the senior board members began, voice clipped, "the markets are clear. The regulators are clear. The Carter Global name cannot survive with you at its helm. For the sake of what remains, resign." The word cut like steel. For a moment, Richard didn't move. His jaw flexed, and his eyes flickered toward me. Then Ethan. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself into the chairman's seat one final time. He scanned the room, every board member leaning forward in tense expectation, then exhaled. "I resign," he said flatly. The syllables dropped heavy in the silence, and with them, decades of dominance shattered in an instant. The room erupted with hurried calls, sighs of relief, shuffling papers. But Richard sat unmoving, a statue of defeat, eyes hollow, his empire stripped away. While the chaos swirled, I slipped into his office, the one he had ruled from for years. The oak desk loomed, stacked with contracts that no longer carried weight. I rifled through the top drawers, my pulse quickening. Among the scattered documents, one name repeated: an Origin Logistics executive. Not indicted, not frozen out, simply gone, absconded through cracks in the system. A ghost who had escaped justice. Sophie pinged me through the secure line. "One of their leaders is missing, tracing digital trails, but it looks deliberate. Someone protected them." Her voice held an edge of warning. Back in the office, Richard sat alone, staring out the window at the city he had once dominated. His reflection was faint in the glass, his shoulders sagging. He muttered without turning, his voice raw, fractured. "They'll come back, and you'll be the first they target, Emily." The words crawled into the silence, a curse more than a warning. That night, as I shut down my laptop, an alert blinked across my private account. The subject line was simple, chilling. "The war is not over." The signature pulsed beneath it like a wound reopening. Origin. Snow fell in soft, relentless curtains over Washington. The city muffled in white, as if the world itself wanted to bury the noise of months past. My boots crunched against the courthouse steps as I emerged into the pale morning light. For the first time in months, no cameras chased me, no voices hurled accusations or questions. The inquiry had ended, Richard had been forced down, and though the scars of it all still marked me, the air tasted almost clean. Relief settled like a fragile layer of frost, thin but undeniable. I carried that silence into a small cafe tucked near Capitol Hill, the kind of place senators and aides used as neutral ground when they needed to disappear. Its windows fogged against the cold, inside warm with the hum of espresso machines and muffled conversations. Ethan was already there, hands wrapped around a coffee cup that he hadn't touched. He looked up as I slid into the booth across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Months of fracture and suspicion hung between us, but tonight it felt thinner, as if we both knew there was nothing left to win except the chance to stitch together what remained. "You didn't have to stand with me," I said finally, my voice quiet but steady. Ethan's eyes held mine. "I should have years ago. I let him control both of us. I don't want to be that man anymore." He reached across the table, fingers brushing mine. The gesture was tentative but real. In his gaze I saw not rivalry, not fear, but the first glimmer of reconciliation. Whitmore arrived not long after. his broad frame cutting a silhouette against the snow-smeared glass. He sat heavily, ordering nothing, only leaning forward with that familiar gravity that made rooms bend toward him. "You held the line," he said. "The truth came through because you refused to be silent. That's rare. Don't forget, Emily, rare things are always hunted." His words were not comfort, but a warning dressed as respect. I nodded, because I understood too well. Victories in Washington were never permanent. They were pauses before the next storm. At the counter, Sophie lingered for only a moment. No one else noticed her, just another coat and scarf moving through the cafe. But I watched as she set down her untouched cup, pulling her hood low. Our eyes met across the room. She gave the faintest smile, a farewell without words, before disappearing into the snow, swallowed by anonymity. Her work was done. She was a ghost again. The conversation thinned after she left, the cafe filling with the clink of spoons, the hiss of milk frothing. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe. The storm had broken, even if the clouds still lingered. I turned toward the window, the snow glowing orange beneath the street lamps. My reflection in the glass was tired, older, but steadier than before. The words came out before I realized I was speaking them, soft enough that only Ethan and Whitmore heard. "I was never just a translator," I whispered. "I was the one who listened when no one else did." It was truth and defiance woven into one. And for the first time, I felt at peace with it. The waitress arrived with a manila envelope, her brow furrowed as she set it down. "Someone left this for you," she said, shrugging, and moved on. My pulse tightened as I slid it closer, the weight of it heavy and familiar. Breaking the seal, I froze. Inside, stamped in black ink against cream paper, was a crest I had prayed I would never see again. Origin. The war had not ended. It had only shifted shape. Cameras burst in frantic light as I stepped onto the plaza podium, the winter air sharp enough to sting my throat. January winds carried the echoes of everything that had fallen Carter Global's empire, Richard's legacy, the long shadow that had silenced me for years. Now it was my turn to speak, not as someone's daughter, not as a translator, but as the voice that refused to bend. The crowd pressed forward, journalists shouldering each other, microphones raised like weapons eager for blood. I let the silence stretch a heartbeat longer than necessary, long enough to taste the shift in power. Once, his laugh had drowned me. Now, my words would drown the memory of it. "Justice does not arrive on time," I began, steady, letting my voice carry. "It limps, it stumbles, but when it arrives, it stays." Murmurs rippled across the press line, pens scratching, cameras focusing tighter. Behind me, Ethan stood just off stage, his posture no longer one of defiance but of resolve. When I gestured toward him, he stepped forward, adding his vow before the crowd. "We will rebuild Carter Global with transparency and accountability. What my father hid, we will open. What he corrupted, we will cleanse." His voice cracked once, but the determination in his eyes sealed it. Whitmore, silent as ever, took no stage, but I honored him all the same. There were voices that believed in me when I was nothing but a shadow in someone else's room. Admiral Whitmore was one of them. His faith kept me steady when the ground beneath me was breaking. The Admiral inclined his head, the faintest smile crossing his worn features, his presence a living testament that truth needed guardians. The crowd leaned closer, restless, hungry for more. I gave them the words they had been waiting for, the words that had burned inside me since the first boardroom sneer. My father laughed when I was called a translator. Today the world knows the power of words. Applause erupted, waves crashing through the plaza, echoing against the stone buildings of Washington. It was not just clapping, it was a reckoning. I stood straighter, letting the storm of noise wash over me, sealing the vow I had carried since that first dismissal. And yet, even as the sound rose, my gaze drifted across the sea of faces. In the blur of hands and flashes, I caught the stillness of one figure. Their head bent slightly, phone in hand, thumbs moving with calm precision. As the cheers grew louder, I saw the screen light once, before vanishing back into the coat pocket. She's alive. Phase 2 begins. The world cheered my words. Somewhere another storm was already brewing. The storm of betrayal had finally broken, leaving truth gleaming in the aftermath like shards of glass catching the light. Justice had not come swiftly, but when it arrived, it silenced arrogance and restored dignity to the one who had been scorned. When injustice is met with unwavering courage, the final verdict can echo through a lifetime. No wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. If this story moved you, please like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Type 1 if you resonate with the journey, or 2 if you feel something was missing.